Hey, PTG fans. So Will and I have this podcast that we love, and we think you'll love it too. It's called Every Little Thing, and they answer all the big questions, just like these.
How many people are eating a banana at this moment?
What's the difference between a hill and a mountain?
Why is ice slippery?
Where does the poop go?
That's from the wonderful show Every Little Thing. Definitely look for it on Apple Podcasts, and check out the latest episode, How Tunnels Get Built Underwater.
Guess what, Mango?
What's that, Will?
So sometimes you'll set your alarm clock really early, like if you've got a flight or something like that, and then the next morning you'll wake up right on time. Does this ever happen to you?
Yeah, it does.
I'll either do that or I'll wake up at like 2 and then 3 and then 4 and then whenever I have to wake up. But more often than not, it's so weird because you'll wake up like a minute before your alarm goes off. And I was reading this study from the University of Lübeck, and they got some student volunteers to go to sleep. And they told them before that they'd wake them up at either 6 in the morning or 9 in the morning. And then they lied and woke everybody up at 6 o'clock.
So I'm guessing a lot of the people who were told they'd wake up at 6 were like more awake at that time, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And the kids who were told they'd be getting up at 9 were completely groggy and just out of it. But what's interesting is that they were monitoring their bodies the entire time. And so for the sleepers who were told they'd be woken up early, their stress hormones kicked in at around 4:30 in the morning. You could actually see that their bodies were using stress to anticipate these early mornings and prepare them for the early day. And so today's episode is all about stress. What does it do to our body, and how can we use it for good, and what are the best ways to relieve it? So let's dig in. Hey there, podcast listeners. Welcome to Part-Time Genius. I'm Will Pearson, and as always, I'm joined by my good friend Mangesh Hattikudur. And on the other side of the soundproof glass, raking this tiny Zen garden. Oh, it's so sweet, but he's raking pretty aggressively, actually.
Really aggressively.
That's our friend and producer, Tristan McNeil. I think you need to go a little easier, Tristan, but he is getting pretty Zen with it, and he's raking the heck out of this thing.
Yeah, I know. I mean, he does claim it helps him to relax, so I think we ought to support him. And for today's show especially, we should try to keep an open mind to different approaches to dealing with stress, because there really is no one correct way to cope with it. For example, I was reading about this study from a team out of Australia, these neuroscientists from the University of Queensland, and apparently they figured out that when grass is cut, it actually inhibits our brain's release of stress-causing hormones. So it turns out there's a good reason why people love the scent of fresh-cut grass so much. It can actually help you calm down.
Huh, that's pretty interesting. So that's our first tip pretty early in the day. So if you're feeling stressed, just mow your lawn or get an air freshener that smells like mowed lawn. And the truth is there are a ton of other offbeat examples that, are there to relieve our stress. But to start things off, why don't we talk about what stress is and what kind of effects it can have on our bodies?
All right. Well, since stress is something that's always been a part of life, I obviously don't have a great origin story for this one, but the closest thing might be the origin of the term. So I didn't realize this, but prior to 1946, the word stress didn't mean like a mental or emotional strain. Until that point, it was just used to refer to the pressure applied to an object, not to a person's well-being.
So what changed in 1946 specifically that kind of gave it this new meaning?
So there's this Austrian physician named Hans Selye, and that's the year he first coined the term stress while describing his latest experiments. So, of course, this comes back to a rat study because we love rat studies on this show. But Selye had been monitoring the physical responses of rats that had been injected with different hormones and also different tissues. And he found that the rats' symptoms were identical regardless of what they'd been injected with. And what became apparent was that the rats were responding to the trauma of the experiments themselves, and he called this trauma stress.
So I'm assuming the stress that Selye witnessed was involuntary, like, a faster heart rate or an increase in blood pressure. Mm-hmm. I actually looked into this fight or flight response a little bit, and, that's the feeling that gets triggered in your body when the brain recognizes some sort of outside threat. So basically, it starts when the hypothalamus sends signals to the pituitary glands and the adrenal glands. And what that does is it triggers the production of adrenaline and these other stress hormones like cortisol and epinephrine. And then a few things happen when all these chemicals are swirling around in our bloodstream. So for starters, our reflexes and senses are heightened so we can better deal with that perceived threat. The cortisol also pushes glucose out of our tissues and into our blood, and that gives our bodies this extra boost of energy that you might experience if you're really, really stressed.
Yeah, so I'm always amazed by that sort of thing. Like we think of stress as such a negative, and yet it's also this reaction that's supposed to help us deal with these life-threatening situations. Like if our ancestors had to avoid running from a lion or something, that's when stress kicks in and it's helpful. But obviously these sharpened senses don't always help us deal with the more benign things like trying to make a deadline or trying to give a public speech. And for someone like me who is really used to avoiding public speaking, that sort of stress can be debilitating. Doesn't it feel like overkill for the body to still be sending out all these signals?
Yeah, it does. And the response to stress can be a problem when all that extra focus and energy doesn't really have a natural outlet. Part of that's because the stress hormones actually begin to build up. And so that not only keeps us on edge, but it also provokes all kinds of unnecessary responses in our bodies. For example, you know how stress can make some people feel nauseous or sick to their stomach?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because stress hormones push the blood away from the gastrointestinal system and actually redirect it to the brain. And that makes sense because it helps the brain better respond to threats, but there are side effects. And that's when this redirection agitates the microbes living in our gut, and that, of course, makes you feel sick at your stomach.
So I definitely feel that loss of appetite from anxiety, but what's weirder to me is that even though stress can sap your desire to eat, it can also make you gain weight at the same time. And I didn't realize this before, but as stress hormones like cortisol circulate through the body, they relay messages to our fat stores telling them to generate as much energy as possible. And this call to action triggers a process called lipolysis.